Okay, so we're back for chapter 13, section 3, which is all about chivalry, and we're going to take a look at the history of knights, which were known as warriors on horseback. Now, one of the reasons that knights were necessary were due to the fact that nobles and lords were constantly fighting against each other. This is not the point of feudalism, but it's something that came out of feudalism. During the Middle Ages, okay, this was the fact that nobles were fighting, they were defending their own lands. They were trying to take over new territories. This was all about trying to increase their personal wealth. Horsemen or cavalry, soldiers on horseback, became a really important component of battle under Charles Martel, a leader of the Franks during the 700s. He took this idea after actually observing the Muslim cavalry against him in the Battle of Tours, and that's what basically started this ideology of the whole use of cavalry. Next, we're going to take a look, in Europe at least. Next, we'll take a look at the technology of war, some of the things that were changing during this time. We have the development of saddles. Saddles are pretty basic stuff. They're seats that go on top of the horse to keep the warrior or soldier firmly seated there. Then you had the development of stirrups. Stirrups hang down from the horse, which allows the soldier to use their hands more freely because they can balance with their legs. Knights on horseback and their war horses definitely became the most important part of warfare during the Middle Ages. Capital C is going to talk about what the warrior's role was in the feudal society. Basically, they were there to serve the lords, and they needed to defend the land of the lords who they were contracted with. It was the purpose of defending their territory for nobles and lords that they needed to raise these private armies of knights. Knights were most often given land in exchange for their military protection. So the benefit of a knight fighting for a lord or getting into a contract with a lord was definitely to get land in exchange. Now, Roman numeral 2 talks about the knighthood and the code of chivalry. Now, the working definition of chivalry is that it's a complex set of ideals that demands that a knight fight bravely in defense of three masters. Now, the word chivalry comes from the French term cheval, which means horse, or also chevalier, which means horse riding knight. Now, the three masters that a knight would fight for. Number one was the feudal lord. This is the lord that's giving them their land in exchange. This is the person that they have their contract with. But then you also have the heavenly god. Okay, so the heavenly god is, of course, number two on this list. But in common terms, for Christians at least, you think about that heavenly god being number one. Then you also have the lady of choice, which would be the lady that the knight chooses to make his wife. That could be a princess, that could be some other woman that's a noble, so on and so forth. Now, the training of a knight takes a few stages. Usually, the people who would become knights were the sons of nobles, and they began training for knighthood at a very early age. There's three stages to becoming a knight. Number one is the page. Now, a page would be from age 7 to 14. Your job as a page was basically to follow the knight around, kind of do his dirty work, clean up after the horse, take care of his horse, clean the weapons, do any kind of odd jobs. And then also you're doing some observation of what it was like to be a knight. Next, we're going to take a look at the squire. A squire is ages 14 to 21. So if you were a good page, then you could become a squire. And what your job was as a squire is maybe to practice, riding the horse, getting the armor on, utilizing the weapons, doing some sparring with the knight. And then you could then become a full-fledged knight from the age of 21 until you were able to still fight. Now, part of the training and part of what knights did to practice were called tournaments. These tournaments are mock battles that knights would participate in. They would do some jousting, they would ride the horse at each other, and then they'd have the long spear, the joust, try to knock each other off. These were actually very dangerous. They were very close to real battles as far as the difficulty level and the way that you could get injured. Okay, many knights were injured and some were killed in the tournaments alone. Capital C is going to talk about the fact that aside from tournaments, the warfare during this time was pretty brutal. This time you had in the 1100s, you had massive walls that were encircling stone castles. Most nobles, because of the constant fighting, they began to use their money to build these big guard towers and these castle walls to defend their manors and estates. Most people associated nobility, or most people associated with nobility, meaning nobles and their families, they had their homes inside of castles for defense. One of the coolest pages in your textbook is page 366. I'm going to take a look at that real quick. All right, this is about castles and siege weapons. Okay, you can see here's the castle. This is what it would look like. They would, of course, have archers up here and other warriors, but they also had, for defense mechanisms, burning pots of lime oil, which they would station around, and they would dump that down on the soldiers below that are trying to get in the gate or that are trying to dig under the wall. Now you have siege towers, which allow soldiers to climb up staircases inside, and then it drops them off at the top, and there'd be hand-to-hand combat there. You've got a mantlet that generally protects the soldiers. You've got a tortoise that protects them. Some battering rams had covers like this, but not all of them. Okay, they didn't all have this type of coverage. Trebuchets were starting to become more common during this time, but not every noble's army had one. That's not something that was all too common on every battlefield. Okay, and then down below you have some other weapons like a catapult and some other basics there. Okay, back to the basic lesson here. We're at Roman numeral number 3, the literature of chivalry. Now, most of the literature during this time was predicated around epic poetry. You've got a poem that sort of talks about a knight maybe going on some type of adventure, probably saving some type of queen or princess, something along those lines, usually that knight's lady of choice. That's sort of the style and combination of poetry during the Middle Ages. Then capital B, you have something called love songs. There was a special group of people called troubadours. They were traveling poets slash musicians. They would go around and basically play music for women throughout the castles and courts of Europe. Generally, the topics were love songs. A knight or a prince may hire a troubadour to go and do the old rock throwing at the window and then play a song in honor of their achievements and whatnot, and explaining that they loved the lady of choice that they were there for. One of the most famous women who had a lot of these troubadours and letters and poems written about was Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor of Aquitaine was from France, but she eventually became the Queen of England. She was the most celebrated woman of the Middle Ages. She was really well sought after, mostly because by marrying her, you could gain the lands of Aquitaine, which was a very prestigious part of France. So eventually, to make a long story short, she became the Queen of England, and she was the mother of 2 future English kings. Those kings were Richard the Lionhearted, who had a lot of fame in, of course, the Crusades. Both of these brothers are often topics of discussion in the Robin Hood stories, but then his younger brother John was known as John the Soft Sword. So he didn't have as great of a nickname as Richard, and he lost many battles, of course, against France. So that's why he got that nickname. Next was Roman numeral 4. We'll talk about women in feudal society. Women in general during the Middle Ages were seen as inferior to men, and this was sort of the accepted view of both society and of the church at the time. Capital B talks about noble women. Now, there's a difference between noble women and, of course, peasant women. Nobles could inherit an estate from her husband, and then she could also act as a military commander of knights if she were to inherit that land. But in general, the women were confined to the activities of the house or even the convent. Capital C takes a look at peasant women. Peasant women generally worked in the home, the field, they bore children, and they took care of the family. They worked constantly. In general, they were very poor and powerless in most cases, so they really didn't have many rights. They were generally working on the Lord's manor. They were married, but they had to do a lot of work throughout the day while their husbands were working also. There is a primary source comparison of these two different social groups or classes of women, and that can be found on page 368. Thank you.